Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be here in front of you in this wonderful place. I will be speaking to you today about the IWTO Green Book Project, but more broadly about the language that we use to describe our footprint and about opportunities that are arising as we complete more science and as we advance the science and understanding of our fibre and its place in the global market. The IWTO Green Book as a project commenced last year in July. It represents a very generous funding contribution from the Italian wool trade through SMI. That initiative has attracted co-investments from other countries, as is the nature of IWTO and these partnerships. The Green Book entails two complementary components. The first stream is a technical compendium. I'm not sure how much all of you know about IWTO's functions. One of its key functions is that it provides the international framework for wool testing standards and wool trading and commercial engagements. These are the Red Book and the Blue Book. The Green Book will complement these standards. It will address wool's eco-credentials, supply chain integrity standards. It will designed to assist stakeholders combat misleading narratives. And its target, at least initially, are brands, retailers, and final consumers. The second component is we are working very hard on some new science, some new research to challenge the unfair narratives that exist. And again, I'd like to acknowledge one of our funding partners, in this case, Cape Wools in South Africa, and also others who have contributed to this work, including Woolworks in New Zealand. Now, we are in a contest of ideas. I've been part of this industry's attempt to build its scientific eco-credentials over the past 15 years, and we share them with people such as EcoBelice. We use the science to inform our marketing efforts, which for a small industry are so important, but also it's such a challenge because we are small in a sea of other competitors and other competing interests. One of the greatest areas of challenge is not so much the science, it's how the science is represented in accounting systems. I'll give you an example here from the journal The Ecologist, and it's about the environmental impact of wool. This is from 2019, authored by Elisa Allen. And it draws on lifecycle impact assessment terms to characterise wool as a nightmare for the living planet. Now, these arguments are swamping, I believe, the conduct of good science, and they are trumping reality with accounting reality. If you read the article, what you actually see are all the key hot words about methane, about gobbling up precious land, about, sheep are Humvees of the environment. In this case, in this ecological journal, the author was Elisa Allen, who was the director of PETA. But that article would just as well, if you read the text, be written by somebody representing the EU PEF, as it was 6 months ago, or the HIGG Index, or made by. The issue I wanted to flag is who wins, who's winning with these current accounting methods and with lifecycle impact assessment based indexes. Here's an example of it's the HIGG MSI, its scorings for different types of fibre using environmental damage units. If you believe the HIGG index, then the worst fibres for consumers to use are natural fibres. And weirdly, by incredible irony, the ones that are the best are the ones that are the most consumed and underpin fast fashion. I've been involved representing the industry since about 2008 in this area, when I went to visit a group in Denmark, I think it was, called Made By. And their index, which had been developed by Brown and Willimans in the United States, ended up informing the Nike Materials Sustainability Index, which was then taken over by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which was then rebranded as Cascale and has now been licensed to Worldly. So these tools have existed for a long time. Generally what happens once they get criticised a lot or focus is given to their flaws, they tend to rebrand and rebadge and re-emerge. It's really important for this industry and for other industries, but also for the authors of these indexes to confront the why and to all of us bring new ideas to the table. One of the areas where we really do need, as a scientist I'm saying this, to challenge the way science is being interpreted is life cycle analysis. What I'm showing you here is the aggregated results from 14 published life cycle assessment studies of wool, 102 observations, 102 case studies. A couple of things should stand out to you. One is the incredible range in the results, the incredible range in calculated intensity. And that's important because it reflects the incredible importance of the assumptions that the researchers choose. I'm a scientist and we're very familiar with torturing the data till it confesses what we want. The other thing I would flag is that the mode in that distribution is somewhere around 21 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of greasy wool. That means the average ewe in France, for example, running around your paddocks, would be expected to be producing twice her body weight in carbon emissions each year. The reason the accounting looks this way or represents the system this way is because it has adopted IPCC-based rules for greenhouse gas accounting. Again, I'm distinguishing science from accounting. These focus on emissions only. They require permanence of removals. And these two things have an enormous impact because it restricts what they are prepared to see. System biology and carbon recycling, or what we call biogenesis, is devalued and misrepresented. You can't count good farm practices, these ones that sequester carbon at the moment. If you're going in a carbon project, you can't count it because of business as usual rules. What I want to show you here, what you can see here is from NASA. It's the combination of two satellite systems. You have the AIRS satellite system, which is mapping the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere about 5 kilometres above our head in the mid-troposphere. So that's the orange. And you'll see how the carbon dioxide levels are going up and down during the year as the seasons pass. The green is from the MODIS satellite constellation, and that is measuring NVDI. So that's measuring the greenness or the amount of photosynthesis that's occurring. Two things I want to show to you. Notice how as the spring and then the summer occurs, the photosynthesis has managed to draw down a massive amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In the equatorial regions, in that band called Middle Earth, where so many of the world's population live, you notice that year-round green means that there's very little carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is food for life. Carbon is food for life. What this is showing you is how, and this is what NASA describes it as, photosynthesis is the lungs of the atmosphere. The primary way that we regulate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is through photosynthesis. That leads me to decarbonisation, and we hear a lot about decarbonisation, but I'm sorry to say it's not really happening. Despite all of the rhetoric and all of the years that we've been talking about this, it's not really happening. One only has to look at data sources such as the global carbon budget. The global carbon budget is a national or international coalition of over 100 scientists from 70 countries who come together to tell us what's happening in the atmosphere with our carbon emissions. The data I'm going to show you shows above that horizontal line the emissions. What's below the line are the sinks or the drawdowns, okay? Let's have a look at what the sectors are doing. So land use change, which is nowadays occurring primarily in the tropical regions through deforestation to grow things like soya beans and other stuff. Last year it contributed about 4 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But mercifully for the planet, that emission sector is declining by about 0.5% a year. So it's more than halved in about the last 60 years. What do you reckon is happening with fossil emissions? Last year they contributed about 38 billion tonnes. There was 38 billion tonnes of new emissions to the atmosphere. That's been growing, it's growing at a faster rate. It's an increasing rate. Every year it's about 1.2% more than the last. The combination, particularly if you add in there's other minor terms like cement carbonation, you end up with a total annual emission flux last year of about 41 or 42 billion tonnes of carbon being added to the atmosphere. And it's growing. Let's talk about the sinks. Well, the ocean is a massive sink of carbon dioxide. So each year, last year was about nearly 11 billion tonnes was drawn down from the atmosphere, and it's actually growing. As the atmosphere concentration is rising, the ocean is actually picking up some of the tab, but it's also acidifying. Photosynthesis is the biggest of the natural sinks. It's last year, if you fit the line, it's about 13 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide drawn down out of the atmosphere. And it's been growing at about 1% per year. You can clearly see seasonality, and if you look carefully and read their report, you can see in there where there's El Nino and La Nina effects. There's even things when volcanoes erupt. It affects photosynthesis. The total is about 23 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide drawn down. So nature is trying to harvest this extra food, but it's being swamped by the rate of fossil emissions. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has been growing at about 1.1% per year since 1960. Last year, nearly 20 billion tonnes was added, more than the planet could pull it back down. When we talk about solutions and we talk about bringing in things like eco-labels, the scale of our problem that we face collectively selects the solution. On this planet, nature has evolved a highly efficient, low-cost system. Let's say 12 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide drawn down onto the land each year, and it's growing. In the process, it absorbs about 120 terawatts of solar energy that, if it was reflected back from the soil surface, would contribute to global warming. So it converts solar energy to chemical energy, food for plants, food for life. That amount of energy that it absorbs is 10 times the value that humans consume in our lifestyles. If you compare that with a highly touted technology, direct air capture, some of you might be aware of this. And I'm drawing now from, particularly focus on Climeworks. They've got two plants in operation, a third being built in Louisiana. Last year, roughly 2,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide was removed from the atmosphere by their fans and condensers, but at an average cost of about 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy per tonne. You can buy carbon credits, you can offset through Climeworks. It costs you, the going rate, if you go to the website, it's $1 per kilo. That's $1,000 a tonne. And you know why it costs $1,000 a tonne? Read the line above. 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy required to do it. So one of the things I wanted to flag with you, that photosynthesis is critically important. And our solution is to grow year-round photosynthesis. With fossil emissions rising at an increasing rate, our key is to draw down more carbon dioxide through income-generating biomass production. Part of the problem with the current systems is it's not about generating money apart from people in the pipeline, it's transferring money from one part of the pipeline to another. So by deduction, you would think that biogenic carbon, biologically active soil that can store more water, should be assets. And so photosynthetic drawdowns and increased rainfall use efficiency, you would think, would be encouraged. But they're not. I want to talk a little bit about prudential accounting standards. Some of you I know sit on boards. I was fortunate to be on the board of a small bank for 8 years, and I had to learn about prudential accounting standards, especially double entry bookkeeping. This underpins our global financial transaction architecture. In prudential accounting standards based on double entry, credits and debits must balance. Okay? Yet in conventional carbon accounting, it operates differently. The credits never equal the debits, let's say the emissions, and that's because of permanence and business as usual rules. These accounting systems which are used for trading purposes are not based on prudential principles. But you can choose to be balanced. In 2018, ISO published ISO 14067, which is their generic standard recommendation for the carbon footprinting of products like wool, like cotton, like polyester. ISO actually recommends it. Now, what I want to focus your attention on is the significance of this standard is that it recognises, it acknowledges the difference between fossil carbon emissions and biogenic carbon emissions. In fact, if you look at number 7 on that, that's biogenic greenhouse gas removals by things like the biomass in the soil, photosynthesis. It requires you to account, and this is the thing about equity. It basically says if you're going to account for the fossil emissions involved in land use change, you should account for the biogenic emissions. It's an equitable standard. And it also allows you to account for the biogenic carbon in products, provided you report it separately. Unfortunately, it postdates all of the key papers that we have written about the farm emissions, which underpin the inventory data sets that we've shared with groups such as EcoBelize. Now, I want to show you something. Conventional life cycle analysis thinking is based on and it derived out of modelling factories. Modelling a product flow and working out the energy costs in factories. It's based on one-way thinking and compartmentalisation. So the sheep feed production system you see is a separate thing to the flock, which is the sheep production system. And you'll note in that there's no provision for recycling. But that has been the global standard. When you apply ISO 14067, you have to reflect the true complexity of biology. Nature is aggressively efficient and elegant in how it recycles. So in our first paper, we highlight the scope of that in the blue there. We based it on the biomass that's consumed. We have to count the outbreath, the respiration. We have to count the sheep mortalities, the manure and urine. What I'm showing you is from our first paper. We submitted it to Agricultural Systems, a top-ranked Elsevier Press journal, in February. So when you map the carbon flows, you can actually break it down and show that more than 50% of the carbon they ingest is returned as manure. That actually only 5% of the carbon they ingest is released as emissions, enteric emissions. So we've done what ISO 14067 says you must do. You have to map the biology. When you do this, we've applied it to a highly cited paper. We can basically show you how the carbon cycle is operating between farms, within and between farms. Okay? So it's highly insightful, and these case study farms are the ones mentioned in the paper. I want to talk to you about impact. In the paper that was published and that we used, the grey bars show you the reported emissions intensity, and the 7th bar there is the average. On 4 of the bars, it reports the expected uncertainty or the variation in the results you should expect. That's the little black bars. When we do, in our study, in our system independently, our first validation we had to meet was to produce results that were highly correlated with the published work and also well within their error tolerances. And we've achieved that. But that's operating, just counting the emissions. If we start to count biogenic flows, we start to reduce the footprint. Now, what we've learned is that the model, as you know, is highly sensitive to the amount of manure produced. So the purple bars are accounting for biogenic flows like the fact that sheep breathe, they urinate water, they occasionally die, they have lambs. And then if you add in a manure, we start by saying instead of 0% manure, which I suspect would be life-threatening for the sheep and for us, but if you count 1 in every 3 pellets of sheep dung only, you end up with the blue bars. That's about a 75% reduction in the reported carbon footprint. And then if you allow for 2 in every 3 pellets of sheep dung to be drawn down, you end up with that. So what it shows, and this is a sensitivity analysis, is that accounting for biogenic flows has a huge impact on what's reported as the emissions. And if you calculate the biogenic emissions embodied in the products, such as the Canadian wool or the Australian wool, for Australian samples, it's about 1.7 kilos of biogenic carbon emissions per kilo of raw wool, or 300 kilos per farm bale. So our principal conclusion is that wool life cycle analyses which do not address system biogenesis will overstate true emissions intensity. We're close to finalising the publication process. It's been provisionally accepted. We're doing some refinements at the moment. But we've only considered half the system. Remember I spoke about the green bit. When you count the green bit, you end up, so this is sheep only ever eat part of the grass. The sheep don't eat the roots. So when you account for actually the biomass that hasn't been grazed, you end up with a very different picture. So this is an attempt to talk about the grazed farm system. Now, of course, it's open to huge assumptions, but a key thing here is we've completed a case study and we've reached out and been very fortunate to partner with a a large farm that has very detailed soil carbon testing records over many years. They test on average 23 paddocks a year, which is no small investment, I must tell you. And from their data, you get to see the soil organic carbon content, and you can derive the soil organic carbon stocks. Beautifully for us in a validation sense, our model predicted that their enterprise for the 2 years we considered, even though it's a drought, would be sequestering carbon in the soil. We suspected this because they spent over $1 million buying supplementary feed because they were in drought, because they didn't want to degrade the paddocks. So real-world case studies are critical to model development, validation, generating evidence and building cases. And we've completed our first. I'm just showing you quickly how that looks. But we need a global set. We've started this process. We've defined the data requirements. We're looking for partners now. We've laid out a strategy through IWTO to do this, and we're looking for partners. Okay? But there is a bigger context here. Agricultural sectors tend to operate as tribes. This is a meeting of the wool tribe. Okay, within the wool tribe, there's a South African tribe, there's an Australian tribe, a New Zealand tribe. The Australian tribe thinks it's better than the South African tribe. And of course, much better than the English tribe, of course. But when we talk sectors and tribes, one of our challenges is if we think about wool versus meat, versus cereal crops, versus cotton. These are all sectors. And when we just try and address some of these issues within our sector, it comes to our detriment. For example, my co-worker in this area, James Blucknow, who's a South African economist, he's made great progress with his partners developing or applying these principles to the beef cattle industry, but also they've developed a tool which is under consideration by the International Dairy Federation for dairy stock. And I just wanted to flag that all of these ruminant industries, in fact, or any photosynthesis-based industry, shares this problem, but also this opportunity. In our model, because it's a wool model, we just don't report the meat emissions, but we could. The model generates them. And it's interesting, amongst the current tenders for the Meat and Livestock Australia, which is it's the sister organisation for AWI, 3 to 4 times the size, they are calling for opportunities. They're calling for tenders for people to do exactly the sort of modelling and validation that we've done. So our ability to challenge these entrenched paradigms about carbon accounting and a misrepresentation of science is going to be limited by the extent to which we work effectively across sectors. If we try and keep it all to ourselves and do it all ourselves, we will fail. So to wrap up, thank you for the opportunity to present. My key messages are that accounting of natural capital is critical for our futures. IWTO and its partners and co-investors recognise this challenge. They're funding the Green Book Project. Current greenhouse gas accounting standards misrepresent the biological realities, and biogenic carbon, biomass, and soil organic matters are assets. They're not liabilities, and they should be accounted. Thank you.
Thank you.